When Rome decided to launch the Third Punic War, it had done so with the expectation that destroying Carthage would be easy. Yet nothing could be further from the truth. Despite the African city dismantling its whole fleet and yielding its entire arsenal before the fighting had even started, the defenders fought like lions. Time and again, determined Roman assaults were thrown back with brutal casualties. However, amidst these disasters, one man distinguished himself in both honor and bravery. Whether that meant suicidally charging into the fray to save abandoned troops or judiciously holding the line to cover their retreat, his name was the first on the lips of every soldier when asked who alone could lead them to victory. This is the rise of Scipio Aemelianus and the Siege of Carthage.
In this series, we've been trying to bring the Siege of Carthage to life. This relies largely on written records, and I really wish we could find some archaeology, but unfortunately a lot of it is lacking for this particular battle. But one place where archaeology doesn't seem to be lacking is up in England, where they trip over all sorts of Roman finds. This story in particular caught my eye about massive-footed Roman garrisons up in Northumberland that has a lot of archaeologists scratching their heads. I found this story thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that empowers you to be a properly informed consumer of the news. Each day, they pull in thousands of articles from around the world and organize them by story in one place. And for each story, you'll get a visual breakdown of the political biases, reliability, and ownership. So let's return now to our story of extraordinarily large Roman shoes. What is great about Ground News, as you can see here, is I get a good summary of how this news story is being treated in the media ecosphere. So here's the bias distribution, left, right, and center, where they lean. I can also see the factuality ratings and ownership. All this is relevant to me because I can potentially spot landmines of misinformation or disinformation, or even just biases inherent in those sources. If I want to learn more about what maybe different sides are saying, even just skim headlines, I can go left, right, and center. For instance, in the left, I see a bunch of sources. One of them is being a bit more clickbaity. They're saying, hey, Roman big feet, what's going on here? Not giving me much information. If I go, meanwhile, on the right, I do find actually a pretty good source here that talks about, it's actually 8 shoes. They're giving me specific measurements. There's more details, equivalent size 49, which is insane about this story. And if I go back to the center, I get even my own recap of this information. So this is all really useful. I get my synthesis of the information, and then I get a lot of tools in my tool belt if I want to dive deeper into any of these particular articles. My other favorite feature from Ground News is the blind spot feed, which shows you stories which might be covered disproportionately by one side or the other. I honestly love Ground News and think they've created one of the best platforms out there in our modern age of disinformation, so definitely check it out. Head on over to ground.news/Invicta or scan the QR code on screen to transform how you read the news and get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. That's ground.news/Invicta.
The year is 148 BC, roughly 12 months since the start of the siege. Having had difficulty in taking Carthage directly, the Romans now seek to entirely cut off its support from the rest of Africa. This begins with the ravaging of the countryside as both punishment and a means of collecting supplies. In such affairs, the legions were shadowed by African cavalry under the command of Famius. These he led from secret bases to ambush and strike at the foragers to deadly effect. It was said that only the tribune Scipio Aemelianus proved resilient to the raids on account of his prudent scouting and well-disciplined operations. Such traits were viewed by the Romans as naturally befitting of his familial pedigree. After all, he was the son of Lucius Aemilius Paulus, victor of the Third Macedonian War and adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, vanquisher of Hannibal in the Second Punic War. From the clay of this lineage, Scipio Aemelianus had molded his own budding career. First as a participant in the Macedonian War, then as a tribune in the Numantine War, where he reportedly won both the mural crown and the spolio opima. Thus decorated, he had pulled the necessary strings to be assigned to the army now in Africa. His exploits would only continue to mount. For now, this meant doing what he could, whilst under the authority of Consul Manilius. Therefore, when the legions had concluded their ravaging of the countryside, Scipio returned with them to the main camp on the isthmus. In retaliation for these depredations, the Carthaginians launched a surprise night attack on the sea fort which housed important supplies. Apparently, a great number of citizens joined in on the effort, making much noise so as to increase the impression of a large host coming forth. This succeeded in panicking Consul Manilius, who kept his men in camp. Only Tribune Scipio took the initiative. Riding out with 10 termi of horse, he too played the act of a larger force by having the squadrons fan out with torches and make feints all across the front. Thus was the enemy's momentum halted and its own ranks thrown into chaos. By daybreak, the Carthaginians had retreated back to the city. The consul Manilius next chose to return to operations in the interiors of Africa. To this end, he planned to confront the field army of Hasdrubal, presently located in Niphorus. However, the road there was winding and flanked by rough terrain, which might hide any number of dangers. Scipio protested, but was overridden by the other tribunes. Thus, they pressed on. Eventually, the legions crossed a river, stumbling upon the Carthaginians nearby. A terrible battle ensued, which saw many die on both sides, but none emerged the clear victor. Towards the end of the day, Hasdrubal pulled back to the local heights, while Manilius attempted to double back across the river. However, the fording proved difficult. Hasdrubal seized on the opportunity to swoop down upon them. Here, he slew vast numbers of Romans, including several of their tribunes. But once more, in this hour of need, Scipio rode out with the cavalry to confront the foe. With but 300 horse, he managed to distract the enemy long enough to allow their comrades to complete the crossing. And yet, in the process, some 2,000 legionnaires had been left across the far bank, where they were in the midst of being encircled. The main army hesitated, considering whether it was worth risking the whole for the sake of the few. But for Scipio, the choice was easy. He immediately set off with the cavalry to rescue them or die trying. Riding hard, this relief force arrived just as the final assault was to take place. Without skipping a beat, Scipio assessed the situation and deftly led the cavalry to a hill behind the attackers, threatening to flank them should any move be taken. At this sudden turn of events, the enemy fled, and the besieged Romans were led back to safety before a pursuit could be mounted. For this, Scipio was hailed as the hero of the legions. Adding further to his reputation was the respect he commanded among the army, allowing him to negotiate the proper burial of the fallen who were left behind. When all returned to camp, Scipio's deeds stood as a small silver lining in an otherwise disappointing campaign. This caught the attention of investigators sent by the Senate to understand the nature of the stagnating situation. As a result, they tasked him with reaching out to Massinissa and the Numidians for support. Unfortunately, the old king would soon die, leaving Scipio to assist in sorting out the situation of his heirs. From this came an agreement to have the Prince Galusa join the Romans with his troops. These, in turn, were used to root out Famius from the hiding places he had been using to harass the Romans. As a final masterstroke, Scipio then persuaded this most formidable enemy to not just surrender, but to actually switch sides. Thus did the year end with a significant shift in the balance of power towards the Romans, all on account of the tribunes' hard work. With the coming of winter, the armies now stood down. Scipio actually returned to Italy, with many wishing he might one day return as consul to be the one who finally concluded the Siege of Carthage. For now, however, it would be the newly elected Consul Calpurnius Piso and his legatus, Lucius Mancinus, who sailed to Africa to assume command of that theatre of operations. That spring, they would kick off the campaign season by striking out at the towns surrounding Carthage. On top of the list was Aspis. An assault was made by land and sea, but these were foiled. Out of apparent frustration, the consul Piso sacked another nearby town despite its inhabitants believing they were protected by a prior treaty. After this, an attack was made on Hippogretta, which had been preying on Roman supply ships. Yet it too proved stubborn in resistance. With Punic help, the inhabitants even managed to destroy the Roman siege equipment. Thus, the consul was forced to end the year's affairs with another failure. Such disappointments were beginning to mount. Making matters worse, they emboldened the Carthaginians, who not only made overtures to the other powers of Africa for help, but also reached out to Rome's enemies abroad, such as Perseus of Macedon. For now, many sat on the sidelines, waiting to see which way the winds were blowing. If things didn't improve for Rome, the situation could quickly get out of hand. A new leader was needed to decisively change the narrative. Back in Rome, the people had but one name on their lips for who might next take command of the war: Scipio Aemelianus. However, there was a small complication. The man was still too young to legally be elected to the position of consul, running instead for that of aedile in the elections of 148 BC. Matters came to a head as Rome's politicians rebuffed the people's will on account of its illegality. In response, a tribune of the people threatened to revoke the right of the consuls to even hold an election at all. Finally, the impasse was broken when a special age exception was made for this year's appointments. Thus it was that Scipio received the unprecedented honor of being elected consul at the age of 36. His appointment to command of the legions in Africa came shortly thereafter. But not all were keen to pass the torch to this upstart. Mancinus, who yet still held command as legatus, made a final gamble to seize the city of Carthage himself. The plan was to target a portion of the wall, which had so far been neglected on account of it being protected by seemingly impassable cliffs. One day, when the omens proved favorable, Mancinus swiftly moved in with a small assault force. These scrambled up the cliff, planted their ladders, and began the ascent. A nearby Carthaginian garrison spotted them just in time. These sallied out to the nearest gate and rushed to disrupt the cliffside operation. A scuffle ensued. When the defenders then attempted to pull back, the Romans followed in hot pursuit. In the chaos, they actually managed to slip through the gatehouse. All of a sudden, the legions were inside the city. Mancinus, who had been monitoring affairs from nearby ships, was just as shocked as the Carthaginians. Without wasting a moment, he ordered an immediate disembarkment. Troops and sailors, half-armed and armored, now followed the commander in a mad dash for the gates. One can only imagine the exhilaration of Mancinus as he effortlessly passed through the threshold of fortifications that for years had bedeviled the legions. Many thanks were especially owed to the gods for granting him this opportunity where so many before had been denied. But first, this toehold in the city had to be secured. One option would be to press the advantage. However, with night approaching, it would be unwise to rush out into the unknowns of the dark. On the other hand, to wait the coming of dawn meant also awaiting an inevitable counterattack by the defenders. Mancinus opted for the latter. Occupying a strong position near the walls, he dug in for the night whilst sending urgent messages to Consul Piso to bring men and supplies with all haste. Just as the messengers for relief reached Utica, newly appointed Consul Scipio arrived by boat. Around midnight, he became apprised of the situation and immediately jumped into action. First, he sent out the cavalry to join Consul Piso in a quick march on the city. Second, he ordered his newly arrived fleet to sail out at once for support. And third, he released the Punic ambassadors with a message to bring back to Carthage. Tell them Scipio is coming. At dawn, Mancinus found that the sun's first rays revealed a vast mob from Carthage bearing down on his position. Though he had 3,500 men under his banner, scarcely 500 of these were armed. The latter of these he formed into a defensive circle to protect the former. With barely a moment to spare, the Carthaginians were upon them. These assailed them from all sides with swords, spears, clubs, javelins, and arrows. The attacks grew fiercer with each part of the circle that was whittled away. Soon enough, the casualties would be so high that the perimeter would collapse. Desperately, Mancinus ordered his men to pull back towards the wall. Here, they would attempt to make a stand, but time was not on their side. Soon, the enemy's pressure was so great that the Romans were pushed back to the very precipice of the cliffs. But just as it seemed the survivors would be dashed upon the rocks, Appian reports, quote, Scipio's fleet came in sight, driven at a tremendous rate of speed, with soldiers crowding the decks everywhere. Gradually, the Carthaginians drew back, and Scipio received those who had been in peril into his ships. Once more, a chance to seize Carthage had failed. But at the same time, a chance to save Roman lives had succeeded, thanks to the quick work of Scipio. Next time, however, he would ensure that there would be no disaster in need of saving. Upon taking full control of the army in Africa, Scipio recognized that to conquer Carthage, he first had to conquer the legions. Over the 2 years of campaigning, these had fallen into a sorry state. Lacking in discipline and poorly supplied, they had fallen to idleness, avarice, and banditry. Worse yet were the camp followers, who had swelled with hucksters and leeches of all kind. Scipio began by first calling up the camp for a speech, stating, quote, The enemy, from the hopeless weakness in which I left him, has risen to such strength, and your labor has been made harder by your laziness. If I considered you to blame for this, I should punish you now. But since I ascribe it to another, I shall overlook the past. Follow the example of my habits and my industry. We must toil while the danger lasts. Spoils and luxury must be postponed to their proper time. This I command, and this the law commands. Those who obey shall reap large rewards. Those who do not will repent it. And with that, he dismissed the troops, whilst ordering that the camp be entirely purged of all non-soldiers. Only those bearing necessary foodstuffs may return. All exceptions were subject to Scipio's final approval. In the days which followed, the men were thus renewed in spirit and focused in purpose. This was likely further honed by drills and exercises. But such practice did not last long. Soon their mettle would be put to the test against the walls of Carthage once more. This would be Scipio's first true trial of command. Join us next time as we continue the story of the Siege of Carthage. For now, you can catch script previews and download HD versions of our art on Patreon and YouTube memberships. A big thanks to the current supporters and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.